Whispers in the dark. The door was locked, but it wasn't supposed to be. For weeks, Alice had come home to an empty house, the familiar creak of the floorboards greeting her like a whisper from the past. Each day, she entered through the same door, turned the same key in the lock, and stepped into a space that had once been hers, her sanctuary. Until tonight. Tonight, everything was different. The key turned easily, too easily, almost as though the lock had been tampered with. Her heart skipped, her fingers trembling as she pulled the door open just a crack. The air inside was colder than it should have been, even for a late autumn evening. She hesitated at the threshold, the familiar darkness of the hallway stretching out before her like the mouth of a cave. "Hello," she called, her voice unnaturally loud in the silence. No answer, just the soft, ominous tick of the old grandfather clock in the corner. But something wasn't right. The shadows seemed deeper, thicker. They clung to the corners of the room, as though alive, waiting, watching. She stepped inside, the door creaking behind her, then shutting with a soft, final thud. The feeling of being watched crept up her spine like a cold finger. Alice was no stranger to the unsettling quiet of her home. She had lived here for years, but tonight was different. The air felt dense. It wasn't just cold, it was suffocating. She made her way to the living room, her breath shallow. The light from the hallway cast long, distorted shadows on the walls. But there, in the middle of the room, was something that made her blood run cold. The lamp on the coffee table flickered on, though she was certain she had turned it off before leaving. The dim light illuminated the dark room, revealing something that shouldn't have been there. A single piece of paper, folded neatly, sitting on the center of the table. It hadn't been there when she left. Alice's hands were ice as she reached for it, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper. She unfolded it carefully, dread pooling in her stomach as she read the words scrawled across it in dark ink. "I know you're here." Her heart stopped for a moment, and the world seemed to narrow down to the words on the page. Her pulse quickened, her eyes darting around the room, searching the shadows. She was alone, wasn't she? But the longer she stood there, the more certain she became that someone was in the house with her. Someone had been here, watching. She stumbled backward, her mind racing to process the impossible. Who had left this note? Who knew she was here? She hadn't told anyone she was coming back tonight. Her friends, her family. No one had known she would return early from her trip. The silence pressed in on her, thick and heavy. She turned on her heel, eyes scanning the hallway behind her, as if expecting someone to step out from the shadows. There was nothing but the oppressive quiet and the cold that was growing unbearable. And then, just as she was about to breathe again, the floorboards creaked behind her. Alice froze. She wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she slowly turned toward the sound, her breath coming in shallow bursts. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, just out of sight. The outline was faint in the dim light, but there was no mistaking the shape of someone standing there. Someone watching her. Her mouth went dry, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. But before she could move, the figure stepped forward, revealing only the faintest glimpse of a face in the dark. The shadows clung to them, but there was something familiar about the posture, the way they stood as if waiting for her. "Who's there?" Alice's voice was barely a whisper, her heart thudding in her chest like a drum. The figure didn't speak. Instead, it moved again, taking a single step closer. And then the light flickered out. Everything went black. The darkness swallowed her whole. Alice stood frozen in the pitch black, her body trembling with the weight of the sudden silence. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, louder than her breath, louder than anything. She reached out blindly, her fingers grazing the wall, searching for the light switch. But her hands met nothing, just the cold, empty air that seemed to stretch forever. The shadows felt alive, swirling, shifting, as if they had a mind of their own. She could almost hear them whispering. A soft rustling sound broke the stillness, a movement she couldn't place. It was coming from the direction of the hallway, where the figure had stood moments ago. But now, there was no one there. The absence of sound was even more suffocating than the silence. It was a kind of quiet that made Alice feel small, insignificant, like she wasn't supposed to be there. Her mind raced as she fumbled for her phone in her pocket, fingers numb from fear. It was almost like the darkness had weight to it, pressing down on her. She found the phone and clicked the screen to life, the faint glow a lifeline in the overwhelming blackness. The battery was almost dead. She cursed under her breath and immediately switched on the flashlight, directing the beam toward the hallway. The light trembled in her shaking hand as it illuminated nothing but the empty corridor. The shadows seemed to pull back slightly, but there was still something there, lurking just beyond the edges of the beam. Something she couldn't see. "Hello." Alice's voice was tentative, barely a whisper. She knew no one would answer. No one ever did. She took a shaky breath and stepped forward, her footfalls muffled by the thick carpet. The note, the figure, the locked door. Everything was unraveling in her mind, each question spinning out of control, each answer just out of reach. Her feet moved without thinking, pulling her toward the hallway where she had seen the figure. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, its weak light revealing the cold, empty space in front of her. The hallway stretched out like a tunnel, narrowing at the far end, where the stairs led up to the second floor. She reached the edge of the hall and stopped, her throat tight with fear. The stairs loomed in front of her, the old wood creaking slightly beneath the weight of the air itself. Was someone up there? A chill ran down her spine. Then, the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open echoed from upstairs. Alice's blood ran cold. She knew every inch of this house. There was only one door upstairs that creaked like that, the one at the end of the hallway. It hadn't been open when she left, and now it was. Slowly, uneasily. She couldn't move. The sound of the door moving was followed by a soft shuffle of footsteps, barely audible, but loud enough for Alice to hear. They were slow, deliberate, coming toward the stairs. Her mind screamed for her to run, to turn and bolt out of the house, but her body was rooted to the spot, frozen by fear. What if it's him? The thought whispered in her mind. The figure. The note. "I know you're here." The footsteps grew louder. The flashlight trembled in Alice's hand as she raised it toward the stairs. And then she saw it, a figure standing at the top of the staircase, a shape that was only half visible in the faint glow of the light. The shadows wrapped around the figure like a cloak, making it impossible to distinguish features. Alice opened her mouth to scream, but nothing came out. Her voice was swallowed by the fear, her throat tight as she backed away, every instinct telling her to flee. But she couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The figure stood motionless, not moving a single inch. And then, just as she thought she might break, there was a sound, a whisper, so faint it might have been the wind, or maybe a trick of her mind. But it was unmistakable. "Help me." Alice froze. The voice wasn't cold, wasn't threatening. It was faint, almost pleading. It sounded familiar. Her pulse spiked, her heart hammering in her chest. "Who's there?" Her voice cracked, her legs shaking beneath her. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move, slowly, deliberately, descending the stairs with unnerving slowness. Each step was creaky, like the house itself was groaning under its weight. "Alice." The whisper came again, so soft, so quiet that it could have been imagined. But Alice knew it wasn't. She knew that voice. Her blood turned to ice. "Mom?" The word slipped out before she could stop it. It was barely a breath, but it was enough to echo through the dark. The figure paused. A long, tense moment passed. And then, the light from Alice's phone flickered once more, dying altogether, leaving her in total darkness. And yet, she felt it, an undeniable presence moving closer. Someone or something was there, inches from her face. She heard the breathing, shallow and slow. She could feel the warmth of it, hot against her skin, even though she couldn't see. "Mom?" Her voice cracked again, desperate. "Please tell me it's you." The figure moved again, closer still. Just as Alice reached for her phone, it flared back to life, the light flickering with a faint whimper before it steadied once more. But when the beam cut through the darkness, the figure was gone. Her heart pounded painfully in her chest as she scanned the hallway frantically. Nothing. The figure was gone, but the air had changed. Thicker, colder, almost alive with tension. She looked down at the floor. There, lying at her feet, was another note. It was folded the same way as the first. The same dark ink, the same familiar scrawl. "I'm sorry, Alice." Her blood ran cold. Her stomach churned. She could feel her legs threatening to give way beneath her. But she forced herself to read on. "It's not me who's doing this. They've got me. Help me. Please, Alice." And then at the bottom of the note, a symbol. Unfamiliar, jagged, almost like a sigil. A feeling of dread slammed into her chest. Alice's world tilted. Her mother had been gone for years. Died in a car accident when Alice was just a child. This was impossible. Or was it? Alice's heart hammered in her chest as she stared down at the note, her mind spiraling with disbelief. The last time she'd seen her mother was in a hospital room, lifeless and cold. The accident had been brutal, the kind of tragedy that rips apart a family, leaving nothing but jagged pieces to try to put together. But here she was, standing in the house where her mother had once lived, reading a note that seemed to be written by someone, or something, that knew everything about her. "It's not me who's doing this. They've got me. Help me. Please, Alice." The words twisted like a dagger in her gut. Her mother was gone. And yet, this note, it was as if her mother was here. But how? And what did the symbol at the bottom of the page mean? Alice felt her skin crawl as she looked around the dark hallway. The oppressive silence pressed in around her, making every creak of the old house seem like a threat, every shadow a hidden presence. The air grew thicker, colder, as if something unseen was closing in on her. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. She could hear the soft shuffle of footsteps behind her, faint but unmistakable. Was someone following her? No, she whispered to herself, shaking her head. It can't be real. It can't be happening. This is just a trick. Her breath was shallow as she forced herself to move. She needed answers, needed to understand what was going on. But her legs felt like lead, her mind unable to focus as fear clouded her thoughts. Turning away from the hallway, Alice's eyes landed on the old wooden staircase. The light flickered again, casting the entire room in a strange, stuttering glow. She couldn't stay here. Not like this. There had to be an explanation, a rational one. Maybe someone was playing a cruel joke. Or maybe there was a logical reason for all of this. Maybe her mind was playing tricks on her, strained from too many sleepless nights, too many long flights, and too many miles away from home. But then, the whisper came again. "Help me, Alice." This time, it was louder, closer. She spun around, her flashlight shaking in her hand. But the hallway was still empty, still dark. But Alice wasn't alone. She felt it. The air had thickened even more. The temperature had dropped. And there was a distinct sense of something watching, waiting. Her instincts screamed at her to run. But she stood frozen, her heart thudding in her chest. The flashlight's beam fell on the far wall, where something new had appeared. A deep scratch, carved into the old wood. It looked like the mark of a claw, jagged and deep, as if something had torn through the wall itself. And then she heard it, a low, guttural growl. Alice's breath hitched, her eyes wide as she whipped the flashlight around. For a split second, the beam flickered on a figure, half formed in the shadows, a silhouette of something that shouldn't be there. Her heart stopped as her gaze locked with the dark shape standing at the far end of the hall. It wasn't her mother. It wasn't human. The figure was tall, impossibly thin, its body twisted at an unnatural angle. Its face was a blur, a shifting mass of shadows that never seemed to resolve into anything concrete. But the eyes, those eyes were unmistakable. They were bright, cold, gleaming with an intelligence that felt ancient, malevolent. Alice stumbled backward, her mind racing. No, 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 no. You're mine now, the creature whispered in a voice that was both everywhere and nowhere. It felt like it came from the very walls, the floor, the air itself. Before Alice could react, the figure moved, faster than her eyes could follow, and it was right in front of her. She felt its presence, its cold, suffocating presence pressing against her, enveloping her, swallowing her whole. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room fell silent again. Alice's heart was pounding so loudly she thought it might burst from her chest. She stood, motionless, frozen in place. The darkness that surrounded her felt heavier than before, but the air was no longer cold. In fact, it had warmed, and for a brief, fleeting moment, the fear began to recede, like the creature had been nothing more than a figment of her imagination. But as her hands trembled, as she slowly tried to steady herself, she heard the whisper again. "Help me, Alice." And then, she knew. The voice wasn't her mother's. It wasn't even human. It was the creature, or something worse. It had pretended to be her mother to draw her in. It had used the memory of her mother's death to twist her perception, to confuse her. The truth was worse than Alice had imagined. She wasn't just dealing with a haunting. She was standing in the middle of a trap, a place where something had been waiting for her all along. A place where something that was neither human nor ghost had been biding its time, feeding off of her fear. And now that she knew it was real, now that she understood the trap, the worst part was that she couldn't escape it. Her heart sank as the whispers grew louder. "Help me, Alice." In a final, desperate attempt, Alice turned and bolted for the front door. She fumbled with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked from the inside. Panic rose in her throat. No, 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 no. She slammed her shoulder against the door, but it didn't move. And then, a cold, wet breath was on her neck. Her scream was swallowed by the darkness. Epilogue: The House That Waits. Days later, when the police arrived, they found the house silent, abandoned, as though it had always been empty. The front door was locked, the windows shut tight, and there was no sign of Alice. Inside, the only thing they found was a single note, lying on the floor of the living room. It was identical to the ones Alice had found earlier. Only this time it was signed, "It's too late, Alice. You should never have come back." The symbol at the bottom was the same, and as the officers left the house, they heard it, a faint whisper on the wind, carrying through the cracks of the old house. "Help me, Alice." But Alice was gone, and whatever had taken her, whatever had been waiting in that house, was still there, waiting, watching, for the next person who dared to step inside.